Yeah, to understand why this is not approved, first you have to understand why it's
Hello, how are we doing today?
Good, how are you?
Just say when. Everybody ready? Well, good afternoon. I appreciate everyone being here today. Before I get into the details of the findings and recommendations of the grand jury, I want to give appropriate and well-deserved recognition to those who spent countless hours on this matter. Specifically, Auditor Gary Jones and his team, who did a very thorough and professional review of the agency in question, as you will see in their investigative audit. They have included a list of recommendations that they believe need to be implemented. Auditor Jones, I appreciate your work and the work of your fine staff in this matter. I want to also recognize agents with the FBI and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services who came at our request to look into the movement of federal money. Thirdly, the prosecutors, agents, and investigators in the Office of Attorney General who work in the multi-county grand jury unit led by Deputy Attorney General Joy Thorpe. Joy, thanks to you and your great team. And of course, the grand jurors, Oklahoma citizens, Oklahoma civilians who heard hours of testimony, interviews, reviewed countless documents, and came up with a set of comprehensive recommendations to fix the Department of Health. So I will move to the most important finding by the auditors, prosecutors, federal agents, and grand jurors, which will be very hard to comprehend. The agency was and is solvent. The $30 million emergency supplemental appropriation was unnecessary and still sits untouched in an account at the Department of Health. The agency had money all along to make payroll. The red flags, which were waved by senior management, were completely inconsistent with the financial situation at the Department of Health. Perhaps the most devastating and disgraceful determination was that 198 Oklahomans lost their jobs for no reason, leaving other Oklahomans throughout the state without essential services the Department of Health is expected and required to provide. The grand jury found, and Auditor Jones' team found, that through manipulating state and federal dollars, leadership at the Department of Health was able to build discretionary funds in a federal account out of sight of the agency's board, the legislature, and the governor's office. Using these improper accounting practices, leadership was able to show a balanced budget. The system was subject to manipulation due in part to a nearly 40-year-old financial tracking system that operates independent of the statewide payroll system operated by the Office of Management and Enterprise Services. So, though these findings were reprehensible, no state or federal money was embezzled or stolen. And to paraphrase from the grand jury report, while financial mismanagement, fictitious fiscal reporting, and reckless overspending abounded at the department, no criminally prosecutable conduct was identified by the grand jury. After reading the reports, talking with prosecutors and auditors, there's plenty of blame to go around. From siloed management processes to the hiding and shifting of money to a culture of fear and intimidation instilled by senior leadership into employees and outright incompetence. All of the above are to blame for the failures at the Department of Health. The multi-county grand jury report and Mr. Jones' audit reveals a system of deceit, abuse, mismanagement, and utter incompetence that is so egregious it is hard, if not impossible, to comprehend the rationale behind some of the decisions that were made. The consequences were, as I've stated, unnecessary layoffs and the disruption of essential services in communities across the state. Quite simply, this can never happen again. I will now share some of the key findings and recommendations by the grand jury before I turn things over to Auditor Jones to discuss the investigative audit. Some of the key findings include: through manipulation of federal and state funds, the leadership at the Department of Health concealed a slush fund, allowing the department to spend without consequence. Annual budgets submitted to the legislature and OMES were overstated by tens of millions of dollars. The Oklahoma State Board of Health failed to provide adequate financial oversight. Senior leadership dictated what financial information the board received, disallowing the agency's internal auditor access to the board and preventing him from exercising his duty to brief board members, resulting in the board's inability to exercise its statutory fiduciary duty. The grand jury also found that the OSDH financial unit lacks training, education, and knowledge of proper financial systems and protocols. The use of an antiquated internal financial system as opposed to the statewide financial system used by a majority of state agencies was the direct cause of the perceived financial crisis and masked the slush fund. So the grand jurors recommend the following: that the $30 million available to be returned to the state be made available for the purpose of additional performance and investigative audits to uncover fraud and mismanagement of other state agencies. That the Department of Health's statewide financial system be maintained by OMES. And in an overarching recommendation, the grand jury advises that the roles of boards and commissions throughout state government be re-examined. They believe that unpaid volunteers with limited knowledge or experience in state government cannot be expected to exercise adequate informed oversight over complex agencies such as the Health Department. The grand jury recommends that legislation be enacted to amend the embezzlement of state property statute to include the creation or possession of public dollars not reported to the legislature. That a statute be passed that mandates each agency to annually publish a public balance sheet and statement of revenues, expenditures, and changes in fund balance. That there be efforts made to ensure that there is proper training and experience for state employees, particularly those in financial roles. I concur with the grand jury that if these recommendations and others are not implemented, another failure is inevitable. With that, I will now turn to Auditor Jones to discuss the findings of his investigative audit. Auditor Jones.
Thank you very much, and thank you, General Hunter. Let me express at this time that the work that our office did was exemplary, and I'm very proud of that. Specifically, Melissa Capps, who heads up the performance division that headed up this, and also to express from Melissa how well working with the Attorney General's office, specifically Joy Thorpe and her team and the grand jury unit on this. But basically what we boil down to right here is the fact that as we said months ago when testifying before the legislative committee, this is a issue that has to do with management and accounting. And if you don't have the proper management in place with the proper safeguards and the tone at the top, meaning that you have that sense of integrity, overseeing the agency, and you don't have the proper accounting, you can't make those decisions. And that's basically what happened here. I will tell you that we audit the health department twice a year. We audit them in the CAFR, which is the consolidated, the comprehensive annual financial report that's done for the state of Oklahoma. We also do it in the single audit. And be honest with you, when this all came out, we started racking our brains wondering where we missed something. We missed nothing. What we came up with in June was exactly right, because the official records, which is the records that are kept by OMES, were correct. It was the internal records that basically presented the problem. The agency, the $30 million that was appropriate was not needed. The money is sitting in the account right now. They did not have to dip into that at all, and to solve the problems. And as General Hunter mentioned, the needless termination of 198 employees because they didn't understand this is really the tragedy. The lack of the need of the $30 million, like I said, is the fact that you can look at their accounts today and realize that they did not get into that money. It's there available to be redistributed back to whoever the legislature determines it needs to go to. The board failed to exercise their fiduciary duties by overseeing that and making sure that they got the correct information from the financial people, and that they were able to look into that and exercise those duties, because so many times is what you have is the boards don't understand that they are the ones ultimately responsible for the funds of those agencies, and they think they're there as an advisory capacity and don't really understand that they truly are the governing board, and many times they leave that up to the different agencies. Go back here. At minimum, the board needs to make sure they improve the control environment, including the tone at the top, to make sure that people that find things feel welcome to report those, and that they don't have to suffer retribution because of that. The Department of Health needs to immediately get away from the old system, and they need to go to the state system. They tried many years ago to do that, and there were some impediments, but they need to move forward and get that done. While they may need to keep track of some other things through other accounting systems, the official system is the core system that's maintained by OMES, and it ultimately was the one that was correct. It was the problems of them relying on that poor system and that poor environment that made them make those decisions. Additionally, the health department needs to hire a CFO and a controller that truly understands and has the adequate experience in government to understand federal programs and the implementation of those programs. That the CFO should have direct access to the board members and the decision makers, and not be stifled by anybody just above them. And like I said, they need to do away with the duplicate system. And I will tell you that as we went through this process, we started looking and seeing that the money that was, it was put into these accounts, while it was technically a federal account, it wasn't federal money that went into that account. And we think part of the process, the reason that they did that, was that the legislature had a process by which they were going back and sweeping all these funds that were sitting in accounts. So we think that they probably set this account up so the legislature wouldn't come back and sweep that money. And I think this happened in many other agencies across the state as well. But the integral details, as you read the report, you'll have more questions. Our audit team will be available to you next week. We've got a couple of them on vacation right now, but they're available if you have questions on the particular things once you read through the report. But again, the big thing that we want to emphasize is the fact is this did not have to happen. If we've said for years, in fact we've been talking for 7.5 years, that the need for performance audits, where you go in and you evaluate the internal controls and and you make recommendations there, because of the fact that we don't have the ability to initiate those. Our financial statement audit of the official financial statements was correct, but because of this, you're not seeing these things that may be happening internally that may cause these problems. And it's important that the recommendation from the grand jury is that these things get implemented and they're done in such a manner that these things don't happen again. But with that, you want to open up to any questions? And open up to any questions you might have. And again, thank you to the Attorney General's office and the grand jury unit. And like I said, we're very, very proud of the employees in our office and the performance division that worked through this maze of things that were going on to ultimately get to what the situation was. So with that, we'll open up to questions.
What about the 198 employees who lost their jobs? I don't see any recommendations specifically to them. If they lost their job for no reason, should some of them be hired back?
There's a new management team at the Department of Health. I think there needs to be critical attention given to the Department of Health's responsibilities in the counties. And once that review's done, there needs to be decision making around which of those 190 employees need to be rehired. But there's a new team, and it's their responsibility to get a handle on where they go from here with regard to those layoffs.
I think one thing that's important too is that there are members in the management of those county operations that came back and made recommendations that they should have been listened to. Because when they came back and said, we're going to save this amount of money, they came forward and said, well, this is the total amount of money that you would be saving, a large portion of that is federal money, a large portion of it is money that comes from millage within the counties. So the savings to the state was significantly less than what was anticipated. And those people on the local level knew that, or at least in one case, and that's why it's important that the people at the local level, that it's a team effort between the local county health departments and the state department as well.
Yeah, management's a 360-degree proposition, management and leadership, and that approach to managing the Department of Health was absent. So if there would have been more transparency, if there would have been more open-mindedness to input from the counties, this could have probably been headed off. But the financial system, I'm old enough to know what a Rube Goldberg machine is. For those of you who don't, there was a cartoonist who would assemble these cartoons and they'd show this incredibly complex machine, jerry-rigged machine, and it would be a very simple function that would occur, but as a result of all these, complex pieces of the machine. And so that's my view of things. This was such a complicated mess that there was a decision made that it couldn't possibly work and that it had to be a disaster. In fact, as complicated and as messy as it was not an insolvency. It was a process that until Gary's team went in and actually was able to do a forensic audit and understand where all the money was, nobody knew where all the money was and nobody knew how it all fit together.
And it wasn't just a single source, it was in multiple locations. As you started pulling these multiple locations together and started running the total amount of money that was available at the end of each month versus what was due, it never got to the point in any single month where they did not have enough money to pay bills.
How long was some
Question over here and then Nolan Clay.
There was some contracts the department had with other agencies, the Tobacco Settlement Endowment Trust and OU College of Public Health, that were front-loaded. They gave them money up front and basically parked there at these other agencies. Were there not any state laws broken when that happened? Because they pulled it back when they got into trouble last fall, apparently.
Well, we did uncover that, the fact that they did not, and they had that money sitting there. As far as the laws, you have to, I'm the accountant, but you're right. They should have given the rest of that money back. They knew it was there all along. I think it was part of the process by them parking money out there at certain locations where they could pull it back when they needed it. And that's, but that that is in our report. We talked about that. There was also an issue with money going toward reimbursing doctors through OU contract, and there's a couple of things like that were handled improperly, and
But
so
they weren't illegal.
No, we didn't determine any criminal activity that was prosecutable. I mean, certainly laws were broken. There weren't criminal consequences to those laws. And I want to underscore something. There's no evidence that we were able to identify that suggested that anybody in this incompetent management process benefited personally from any of the activities. And so that's an essential part of any kind of action that we would take against these individuals.
Did the employees have a civil course of action to sue the department for wrongful termination?
I can't speak to that as the state's chief legal officer because we would be tasked in defending the state if that were to occur. So I don't want to give any advice to them other than the department needs to look hard at these layoffs, and they need to be reviewed, and there needs to be a decision made about what the department needs to do to serve its customers. Nolan Clay?
You said it was messed up. How long has it been messed up?
well, I think that it's obvious it's been messed up for decades. And what happens is there was enough money, enough cash flow coming in to cover up any of these things that they were doing. When you go through and we did a controlling trial balance from 2011 to 2017, and you could look at how much money was coming in revenues and how much was being spent. In 2013, they started overspending. So if they really were going to have a problem, if they really were out of money, it would have happened in 2016. When they overspent their revenues by $16 million, which meant there was enough money in the system to cover that. And so ultimately, it finally came to a head. Basically, when someone came back and said, you can't use this money that's parked in the 400 fund, which is technically a federal fund, but what they did is they moved money that was not restricted into that fund to make it look to the legislature like it was restricted, but it was available, and it says you can be used for the lawful operation of the agency. So that money could be used to pay the bills. And when
Slush fund. Sorry, we're talking about the slush fund. How much are we talking about that they had?
Lisa?
I think it was up to 40 million at one point.
Yeah, up to 40 million at one time.
This gentleman right here is
I'm sorry, this
supposed
is Lisa Hodges from our office.
Just so we're clear, there wasn't any money missing
Right.
throughout this whole thing. It was just some of it was hidden, some of it was secret, and there was actually more than enough. I just want to make that completely clear.
Right.
Okay.
And also there's one thing too, is for instance, they have what they call the clearing account, where that money that comes into this account that's transferred into their operations, they were only clearing that account once a month, which means at some point in time they may have $4 or $5 million that they could have moved over and used. And you take all these other different sources of funds, there was never a point in time that they did not have enough money to pay bills.
to right here and then back here.
Gary, this sounds like a big Ponzi scheme. I mean, that's what it sounds like, that they were moving stuff and people didn't know where it was.
But here's the fallacy of this whole thing. The official records at OMES were correct. It was the internal system that they set up themselves. For instance, they were setting up levels of restriction. You have money that's restricted because of federal grants. It can only be used for a certain purpose. You may have money that's restricted by Constitution. You may have money that's restricted by statute. And you may have money that's restricted by agency policy. This was basically restricted by internal mechanisms within the accounting system. So while it appears to be a Ponzi scheme, it was only a Ponzi scheme within themselves, which means that it was all available. If when you came back and looked at this, you realize that they created their own crisis that didn't have to happen.
Yeah, the difference between this and a Ponzi scheme is they didn't run out of money, which is what happens with a Ponzi scheme and what makes them bad. More questions, excuse me.
So would it be accurate to say that the health department was using an account to hide money from lawmakers for fear that lawmakers would sweep that account?
We don't know that for sure, but what we do know is that because some of the accounting folks within the department believe that if you had your budget set up that says we're going to spend this much money for rent, this much money for all these other things, if you have to dip into the rent, they said, well, okay, we dipped into that fund, we're going to have to pay it back. But it's not a restricted account. So that doesn't have to be paid back. So what they did is they created this internal mechanism that says that we owe us money and that money is restricted. Well, if I owe it to me, I just wipe it clean. And then what they should be doing, and this is one of the recommendations that was made, they should be preparing annual financial statements. And at the end of each year, they should reconcile in any of those things that are where they can be closed out. They ought to be closed out at the end of each year. What they did is they kept this going for a long period of time, thinking that a good example is Vital Records. Money that came in for Vital Records, they said, okay, if we take money out of Vital Records to pay for something else, we're going to create an accounts payable to Vital Records. But you don't have to do that because the money coming in for Vital Records says this can be used for the lawful operation of the agency. So they artificially created mechanisms upon themselves to show restrictions that never should have happened.
So the House committee that was investigating all this, that you testified before, they never issued a report, is that correct?
I don't know. I will tell you that when I testified before them, I said that keep in mind that there needs to be a performance audit on these agencies, because the internal things you're talking about would have been found out in a performance audit. I also said that you need to do these financial statements because what happens now in the budget process, they're worried about one thing. They're worried about the appropriation amount. How much did you appropriate last year and how much are we going to appropriate this next year? But they really went back in and looked at all the sources of money, which when we ran that controlling trial balance that came out of the core system that says, here's all your sources of revenue, here's all your expenses. And you could see, and you look at how much money do I have in all the accounts. For instance, if you spent more than you brought in, it's okay as long as you have money in the right accounts to cover that. And they don't have that mechanism. And they created this massive system that basically made it extremely difficult for them to make those decisions they need to make.
The
Right here.
people at core said their core system doesn't have the insight into the sub-level of the programs that go to the health department. So how would putting that on the core system, how would that help what was going on?
I think is it DHS or health department or healthcare authority?
I think they
There's an agency that actually has more federal programs than the health department does, and they're on the core system. They can keep track of those sub-accounts through a different system. For instance, let's keep track of all the federal funds, and we know that we can't spend these other than on these federal programs. And you can have a subdivision, whether it's an Excel spreadsheet, whether it's Access, or some program by which you keep track of that. And you separate those. These are restricted by grant, by federal. These are restricted by statute, and these are unrestricted. And you can keep those.
I mean, wasn't that what they were doing? They had a whole bunch of Excel spreadsheets that showed those accounts and how much they're borrowing against that.
Well, and there's the problem. The problem was they were divided so much that they said, okay, here's all these things that are all these state funds that can be used for the lawful purpose of operating the agency, but they were saying this is for Vital Records, so the money came in from Vital Records, so it has to be used for Vital Records. It doesn't. It can be used for the operation of the office. So what they did is they created this mechanism by which they self-restricted themselves when they didn't have to.
So they can use fee revenue for Vital Records to pay a payroll out in accounting.
If it's that particular account, if it's for the lawful operation of the agency, you could do that.
Why do you think the
Right here and then back there.
I was
Right
gonna
here.
ask just quickly, why do you think the legislative probe didn't uncover this? It was a high-profile probe. Why do you think your findings are different than the legislature's? Not yours, but I'm saying you guys.
I don't think either Mr. Jones or I want to speculate about that.
I will tell you this,
Yeah.
because of the fact that they did not have the expertise to ask the right questions.
Yeah.
I mean, when we walked in there and we looked at this, I mean, keep in mind, we had 4 CPAs and other people. We had like 7 people working on this project and going through looking to see. And finally, when you start looking at well, you find that maybe this account here could be unrestricted. And then you find this money that's not transferred that could be transferred out of the clearing account. And you start pulling all this together, and all of a sudden, having that financial expertise to, number one, know how state finance works. If you walk into an agency and someone says this money is restricted and it's sitting in a 400 account, you're thinking, okay, it's restricted because it's federal funds. But you don't know that the source of that money was not federal funds that just got parked over there. So until you really start going through and analyzing where the funds came from, what they can be used for, and where all the different sources of revenues are, then it all of a sudden becomes clear to you they never ran out of money. Now, first thing you do, if someone says, I don't have enough money to pay my car payment, what's the first thing you do? You call the bank, find out what your balance is, because maybe my reconciliation of my checking account is wrong. When you went back and looked at all the total amount of money that was available, and then you figured out that some of this money they show is restricted, it's not restricted, then you would come to the conclusion they're not out of money. They just think they are.
Right here, this young lady.
I wanted to make sure I understood this. So because they misunderstood that some money was restricted when it wasn't, that's how they came to the conclusion that they only had $15 available in the Ryan White Fund because they were counting out all this money that they thought was restricted but in fact wasn't.
Here's the situation. There were cases where things were done wrong. For instance, the money that was taken out of the Ryan White Fund to pay payroll should have never been taken out of the Ryan White Fund. And the same thing when they found out the TSET funds were out there. So you take all these things together, and then you have this level of restriction that they self-imposed. When you start looking at all these things, then you come to the conclusion that they're doing all these things they shouldn't be doing, which they are. But it doesn't ultimately mean that you don't have the money to pay your bills. It's because of the mistrust in management, that tone at the top, and then you had the people that were self-restricting within the accounting department, and then you had other people come in and say, well, if this money's restricted, we can't use it. This money here that's a Ryan White Fund was down to $15 and never should be. Well, if they had gone back and reconciled things as they should have, and only dealt with the things that had to be paid back, then they would realize that, first of all, they never should have dipped into the Ryan White Fund because other funds were available to pay that, and the money that should have come back from TSET and the other sources should have come back. But it's a combination of all those things together that would cause somebody to say, well, you know what, there's something drastically wrong going on here. And what it was a massive, it was the fact that they had made this so complicated that they themselves couldn't even understand it.
Mr. Jones.
Auditor, I hate to interrupt. A lot of these questions are in the report, so we're going to have time for a couple more.
Okay.
I mean, this is the culmination of 9 months
I've got time.
Right.
looking at this. I mean, I don't think it's
But a lot of the questions are being
yeah,
answered.
but I don't think it's a call for to have a 15-minute conversation with reporters about this. We've all
No,
We're not going anywhere.
We're not going anywhere.
Okay.
Okay.
Mr. General Hunter, the Ryan Wright Fund, I'm glad that was brought up. Is it not true that payments were lower to agencies that contracted for that money over a period of time before this was identified? Is that correct?
Give me a specific. That they had lowered payments because of the auspices that they were low on money?
It's my understanding that payments after this was identified increased to agencies that were contracting over Ryan White dollars. Was that discovered in you guys?
But basically, the Ryan White dollars are payment of insurance premiums on behalf of those individuals. And so what happens is when that was discovered, they went back and replenished that fund back to where it should be and made the payments they need to make.
But so were payments missed?
I think there was a delayed payment. I don't know if there was a missed payment.
And is that, and I'm not a prosecutor, is there no criminal culpability if agencies are left to try to pay something that was supposed to be covered by federal money that was not then available?
Well,
Yeah.
I can't speak to any federal decisions, prosecutorial or investigative decisions around this matter.
Okay, and so that was my question.
Well,
are there federal investigations ongoing that you know of?
I can't speak to that.
Yeah. The Ryan White Fund was actually a rebate off of the pharmaceuticals that go directly into that fund. Should have never gone into any other fund. And one of the recommendations is that the OMES sets up a separate fund for that so it doesn't get commingled with any of the other funds.
So is the FBI still investigating them?
Again, that's a question you'll have to pose to federal entities.
You mentioned it back in January that
Yeah.
they were, so I'm just asking for an update.
I asked them for assistance. I've acknowledged that they were very helpful, but I can't speak to the progress of any ongoing investigation that they have as a residual of what we've seen. You know, we're speaking today as to the state's investigation and audit. So you'll have to pose those questions to the FBI or the U.S. Attorney's Office.
Like the lady in black.
I have 2 questions. The first might sound reductive, but how did they recklessly overspend and not run out of money? I mean, we're hearing that they overspent by tens of millions of dollars. Were they over-appropriated?
They overspent their annual appropriations.
Okay.
And basically what happened was as you go through and you look, their expenditures went up, and there's a graph there that shows how much revenues came in and how much expenditures. And they should have recognized that if they did their annual financial statements, they would realize they were going over each year, and they were starting to get their reserve funds pretty low. And so that's basically, they should have started making changes. They did in 2017 start making changes and bringing those numbers down, and subsequently that's probably what ultimately got them to where they did not run out of money.
So they just had enough reserves built up from the past, so they had underspent before?
Well, the majority of the money coming to them is from federal grants, and then they also have a source of money coming that's comes from millage coming from the counties. And so while they have $300 and something million operation, only about 58 million of it, something like that, 55 to 50 to 60 million dollars a year comes from state appropriations.
So the feds were over appropriating them?
No.
Because they had to have extra money at some point if they could overspend by all this much without running out of money, right?
Well, keep in mind that they get money in and then they pay it out, so they have a cash flow that's generated by money that comes in before they have to pay out.
Yes, but where's the extra money? Where's this extra money coming from that they're able to stash $40 million into a slush fund?
Well, it's over a long period of time. You go back and look and see, and you'd have to go back and find exactly where they started putting that money into those accounts.
So they've basically been hoarding extra money away for a rainy day.
Well, and they got to the point where it got very close. I mean, it got to where on a $380 million annual budget that they had about $2 million at some points in time. So.
I have a second question. We're hearing that the money was never missing, it was just hidden. Were Mike Romero and Cynthia Nichols not clued into this slush fund? Why did they think the money was gone?
The money was sitting into an account under a 400 heading, which was federal money. So I can't speak for them, but I would assume that the fact that they did not think that money could be used for these other expenditures because it was sitting in the 400 account, which is federal money, and it wasn't really, it wasn't generated from grants, and it was money that came from other sources that could be used for the lawful operation of the agency.
Yeah, I think it's important to look at this as a problem that over a period of years got worse and worse. There's actually been a succession of CFOs that the Department of Health has hired, and that employee or that hire moved on in a very short period of time. And so you've got, again, multiple years, you don't have good leadership, you've got archaic systems. And so an individual comes in and looks at the mess and decides that it's insolvent, but they really don't have the ability to look at the mess because you've got so many different accounts and such poor financial management. And again, until Gary's team went in and in a thorough, comprehensive way did a forensic audit, nobody knew how much money the Department of Health had.
I mean, in September, Secretary Klein asked for an audit because it got to the point where senior management didn't know what numbers to believe. And so one of them's telling one thing, one of them's telling something else, so they asked us to come in at that point in time, and that's where our involvement first began.
And then we gave Auditor Jones the authority to expand the audit into an investigative 18F audit, which gave your team more authority to look at things.
Is there any indication these slush funds are widespread beyond the Department of Health to other agencies? There's a lot of people who want to do deep dives and deep audits in other agencies.
I think part of our recommendation, Mr. Jones and I would like to find that out. But until the state properly resources the ability to perform or to conduct performance audits, we don't know.
And also, a lot of this could be found in the budget process, by which that they go in and they pull up all the accounts and they truly understand what's in every single account. And that process is lacking, a lot of it because of the fact that you don't have people that truly have true accounting and budget expertise.
I guess a lot of people like to say bad things about OMS. I mean, the acronym itself lends itself to sort of pejorative phrasing, but am I hearing you correctly that in this instance, this would have been a better system if OMS had been
Basically, what you have is the state accounting system. You know, even before OMES, the state finance was the one that kept track of all this. State finance is just a component of OMES. And so if they had implemented the system, the core system's been around for a long, long time. And so if they had, when they came through and tried to reconcile this, instead of saying we can't do it, they should have moved forward and said, okay, not only can we, but we have to.
I guess my question would be, if somebody were looking at this, like a legislator or a committee, and they were thinking, how do we prevent this from happening again? Some people in that investigative committee seem to feel like, well, OMS was too big, it should have never been created in this regard, maybe they should have less influence. They're the problem. It sounds like that's not the case. Is that?
Well, read the report. Read the report and draw your conclusions as overall. And I will tell you, I do believe there's additional oversight that needs to be done, but the people that are providing your accounting aren't the one that should be providing the oversight. That's that you're grading your own work. You need to have an independent group doing that.
This guy, and then we really.
I understand the lack of reason or evidence for criminal culpability, but and you've been addressing a lot of this in legal terms, but I'm trying to think in terms of the layman or person who might be sitting out there reading the story in the paper or hearing on television. In layman's terms, is it fair to say these are creative accounting practices or cooking the books? As they're sitting around the table hearing about this, they may use those terms.
So there's an adage that prosecutors, if they're worth their salt, like to use, and that is, let justice be done, though the heavens fall. If there was criminal activity here, we'd be prosecuting it, and we can all be mad, we can be outraged, which I certainly am. But at the end of the day, we couldn't find anything that we could prosecute. And the important thing here is to understand what happened, which with the good work that Gary's team has put to this project, the grand jury's review, we know what happened, and we need to make sure it doesn't happen again. And our recommendation that this $30 million be liberated and committed to allow for there to be performance audits done on behalf of the state to ensure that this isn't existing in any other agencies and it never happens again.
Would that money go to the auditor's office?
So there are two processes. There's APAC, which is going to be commissioning, I think, private audits, and then there's the state auditor's office. And so there needs to be attention given to, those two tools that state government has to ensure that there's proper accounting, that there's proper reporting, that there's not mismanagement of funds.
The legislature just gave APAC $2 million out of this.
Well, we've been pushing since the first month in office that we thought that a systematic review on performance audits be done, through the auditor's office. Our people, I will tell you that it was the understanding that our people have the state system going in there and really knowing what could and couldn't be done once they identify these accounts. It's going to take somebody else outside the state government a long time to come in and start figuring that out.
A few more questions and then we'll recess.
What's amazing about this is the fact that while it's good that there's no missing money, it's just sad of the repercussions of what happens when people do things improperly. And it was their own internal system of restrictions that ultimately caused this problem.
The House Committee heard a lot about IT spending that the department was doing, maybe outside of OMES as well, under their statewide contract. I mean, does the audit get into some of that spending?
I think we did address the fact that they spent $3.6 million, something like that, on IT, and then ultimately decided not to pursue the contract, or not pursue the project. We believe that they should have continued with that project and got it completed.
Anybody else? We good?
Good.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr.